December 14, 1943, Berlin. The fourth winter of the war pressed cold and heavy on the German capital. Inside a dimly lit office of the Oberkommando des Heeres, a single desk lamp burns over stacks of reports. The air smells of cigarette smoke, damp wool, and fatigue. Outside, distant sirens rise and fade. The nightly warning no longer interrupts the work. At a long oak table, 3 German analysts sit in silence. Their uniforms are creased, their eyes hollow. Before them lie captured Allied documents, U.S. War Production Board figures, shipping manifests, industrial summaries. Columns of numbers stretch across each page like a verdict. One officer runs a finger along the line. B-17 production, 1943, 8,995 units. Another turns a page. Liberty ships launched, 140 in a single month. No one speaks. The only sound is the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, one voice breaks the stillness. Das ist unmöglich. Another man exhales slowly, staring at the page. In that quiet moment, they understand Germany's greatest defeat will not come on the battlefield, but in the factories of America. By late 1943, Germany stood at the height of its territorial reach, yet already on the edge of exhaustion. What had begun in triumph 4 years earlier had become a struggle of endurance, fought not only on the battlefield, but deep within the foundries and factories that fed the war machine. In January 1943, Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, presented his reports to Hitler showing what he called a miracle of German efficiency. The figures were impressive. Tank and aircraft output had risen despite relentless Allied bombing. Hitler, pleased, declared that German organization had overcome the material advantage of the Allies. But the numbers hid a darker truth. The Reich was operating at the limit of its capacity. Raw materials from occupied Europe arrived slower each month. The labor force, increasingly dependent on foreign conscripts and concentration camp prisoners, worked under brutal conditions that undermined quality and consistency. Fuel production, reliant on synthetic processes, barely sustained frontline needs. Every tank sent to Kursk or every Messerschmitt launched over Berlin came at the expense of something else. Another engine, another train, another ration that never arrived. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, an industrial awakening was underway, unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. The United States, once hesitant and distant, had mobilized into what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. The nation's factories, shipyards, and steel mills were not merely supporting a war. They were redefining the scale of it. By mid-1943, American industrial output had already surpassed the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. In a single year, the U.S. built more aircraft than Germany had produced since 1939. Assembly lines once dedicated to automobiles now turned out bombers, tanks, and trucks with mechanical precision. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan was completing a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, launched entire Liberty ships in less than 2 weeks. For German planners, these reports, when they reached Berlin, sounded impossible. Their own intelligence analysts dismissed the early numbers as Allied propaganda. Yet, deep within the files of the Abwehr and the Fremde Heere West, fragments of truth accumulated. Allied production exceeded all pre-war calculations of what an industrial nation could sustain. Germany's system, for all its discipline and engineering brilliance, was fragmented. Competing agencies, the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and SS, each demanded priority, hoarding resources and sabotaging coordination. While the Americans consolidated power under unified management, the Reich's war economy drowned in its own hierarchy. By autumn 1943, the contrast was undeniable. German factories could produce formidable weapons. The Tiger tank, the FW-190 fighter, but in limited numbers, at enormous cost, and with diminishing fuel to move them. In America, mass production favored simplicity and quantity. Sherman tanks, standardized aircraft, standardized ammunition. The philosophy was clear: not perfection, but overwhelming abundance. And somewhere in Berlin, a small circle of German analysts began to grasp this reality. The numbers arriving from neutral sources, diplomatic channels, and captured Allied records hinted at something terrifying. An industrial empire that no bomb could silence, no blockade could starve. Their work would soon reach the desks of men who refused to believe it. By early 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. What the analysts in Berlin had first treated as exaggeration was now backed by reconnaissance photographs, prisoner interrogations, and even intercepted radio traffic. The United States was producing war materiel at a pace beyond comprehension, the kind of scale that rendered traditional military arithmetic meaningless. Factories that had once built automobiles were now turning out aircraft engines by the tens of thousands. Entire shipyards on both coasts worked day and night under floodlights, launching Liberty and Victory ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. On the American home front, the war had become a kind of national rhythm, a single, vast machine of production powered by optimism and organization. The War Production Board, established in January 1942, had orchestrated an industrial transformation without precedent. It converted every possible resource into war output: aluminum from civilian goods, rubber from synthetic experiments, fuel from new refineries, and manpower from every corner of the country. From Detroit to Seattle, from Pittsburgh to San Diego, the nation operated as one enormous assembly line. The German intelligence services, the Abwehr, the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, and the analytical branch of the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, each tried to understand how this was possible. Reports trickled in from neutral embassies in Switzerland and Sweden, and from spies embedded in Portugal and Spain. Some intercepted shipping manifests confirmed that American convoys were crossing the Atlantic with tonnage far exceeding any previous estimate. By mid-1943, the analysts had gathered a mosaic of evidence. Over 85,000 aircraft produced in the United States in 1943 alone, more than 65,000 tanks and armored vehicles delivered across the same period, nearly 8 million tons of merchant shipping launched within a single year. Each figure challenged Germany's assumptions about what war could be. In 1940, when Hitler had boasted of his unstoppable blitzkrieg, the Reich's entire tank force numbered just over 3,000. By contrast, the United States was building that many every 2 weeks, and the quality gap was closing too. American factories emphasized standardization. A single tank model or aircraft design could be mass-produced with interchangeable parts, repaired quickly, and fielded in large numbers. Germany's designs, though technologically advanced, suffered from over-engineering. Each Tiger or Panther required immense resources and intricate craftsmanship, consuming the labor of hundreds of skilled workers and vast amounts of high-grade steel. The Americans approached war as industry. The Germans still approached it as engineering. Inside Berlin's ministries, the numbers began to circulate. Albert Speer received several of these reports and noted their alarming implications. He privately admitted that, if accurate, Allied production would soon make the Luftwaffe's replacement program impossible. Yet even he could not fully convince Hitler, who dismissed such figures as absurdly inflated. Among field officers on the Eastern Front, disbelief slowly turned to resignation. Letters home spoke of empty fuel reserves, dwindling munitions, and the eerie sense that their enemies' supplies were endless. American convoys fed Britain, North Africa, Italy, and soon the preparations for an invasion of France. Everywhere German analysts looked, they saw the same pattern. The Reich's war machine was shrinking. America's was accelerating. In December 1943, a comprehensive intelligence summary compiled by the Fremde Heere West estimated that American aircraft production for 1944 might exceed 100,000 units. The figure was so staggering that one senior officer in the Luftwaffe's planning staff refused to forward the report to Goering, fearing ridicule. But the truth could no longer be ignored. The numbers were real, the implications final. What had begun as a confident campaign for European domination was turning into an economic war that Germany could never win. The front lines would still shift, battles would still rage, and soldiers would still fight with courage. But the outcome had already been decided in the assembly lines and foundries across the Atlantic. And as the analysts in Berlin filed their reports, the realization grew. The tide of war was not turning. It had already turned. Inside the gray-walled offices of the Reich Statistical Bureau and the OKW's Economic Department, the work was quiet, methodical, and unrelenting. These were not soldiers, but mathematicians, economists, and engineers. Men trained to see patterns in numbers, not emotions in battles. Their weapon was data. By early 1944, they had accumulated enough evidence to form a coherent picture of America's industrial capacity. It was not just superior, it was exponential. For every German aircraft built, the United States could produce 7. For every ton of steel rolled in the Ruhr, Pittsburgh and Chicago combined could roll 12. These analysts had no illusions. They understood logistics, throughput, and material science. They compared the productivity per worker, the efficiency of assembly line systems, and the impact of uninterrupted electricity and fuel supplies. America's war machine was not running at full capacity. It was still accelerating. One internal report, circulated in February 1944, stated plainly, even under total mobilization, Germany cannot reach parity with the United States. Their resources of labor, material, and energy exceed ours beyond the realm of military compensation. That line was underlined twice in red pencil. Within these rooms, the realization carried a weight heavier than any defeat at Stalingrad or El Alamein. Because this defeat was invisible, a quiet surrender to arithmetic. The analysts dissected the mechanisms of American production, the decentralization of plants, the reliance on women in the workforce, the use of conveyor systems refined by Henry Ford. Each factor multiplied output. Even transportation efficiency played its role. Double-track railways, standardized freight cars, and fleets of trucks ensuring no factory stood idle. German production, though heroic under bombardment, was a web of improvisation. Bomb damage meant constant relocation, power cuts, and shortages. Precision parts were delayed by Allied bombing of transport lines. Entire assembly chains collapsed when a single factory was hit. Yet in America, redundancy was built into the system. If one plant went dark, 2 others picked up its load. One analyst described it with a chilling simplicity. They fight with mathematics. We fight with courage. Those numbers soon found their way into the Reich Economic Ministry, where they collided with ideology. Hitler's confidence in willpower, his belief that resolve could outmatch production, blinded him to the reports that crossed his desk. When briefed on American capacity, he dismissed it as Anglo-American exaggeration. But the analysts knew better. Their charts showed not just production volumes but replacement rates. Germany could build 1,000 aircraft a month, but was losing 1,100. The United States could build 8,000 and lose only 500. The arithmetic was merciless. By spring 1944, they began using a new term in their reports, material Überlegenheit, material superiority. It was no longer a projection. It was a statement of fact. They no longer asked if Germany could win. They asked when it would collapse. And behind closed doors, among men sworn to loyalty, a dangerous honesty began to take root. That the war's outcome was now determined not in Berlin or Moscow, but in Detroit, Buffalo, and Seattle. Their charts were clean. Their logic was perfect. And their conclusion was absolute. Germany could not outbuild America. It could only fall slower. When the first analytical summaries reached the highest levels of command, they were received not with alarm, but with denial. The men who had built their careers on victory refused to believe that war could be decided by machines, not willpower. Inside Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg, reports on American production were treated as defeatist talk. Albert Speer, pragmatic yet cautious, presented the data with care, framing it as a call for efficiency rather than surrender. Hitler listened in silence, then dismissed the conclusion outright. "They will drown in their own excess," he said coldly. "Quantity has never beaten quality." But beneath the Führer's defiance, some of his ministers understood the truth. Speer's private staff noted in late March 1944 that he appeared grimly realistic about Germany's limits. He began reorganizing what remained of the Reich's industrial network, ordering factories to disperse underground, streamlining production lines, and demanding longer shifts. His reforms bought Germany time, but not hope. Among the officer corps, the mood was shifting. Field commanders on both the eastern and western fronts reported chronic shortages, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts arriving weeks too late. Supply trains bombed, synthetic fuel plants crippled. In May 1944, Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland visited Speer's office and saw the figures for aircraft output. He later recalled the moment in his post-war memoirs. It was as though the war had been lost already. Only no one dared to say it aloud. At the same time, within the analysis departments, a quiet despair spread. The men whose task was to measure the war's progress began to speak in whispers about mathematical inevitability. Some stopped reporting accurate figures, fearing retribution under the Reich's laws against defeatism. The tension between data and ideology was suffocating. Economists and statisticians were forced to present optimistic interpretations. Graphs turned upward, losses understated, and American capacities labeled as probable exaggerations. One internal memo, circulated in July 1944, summarized the paradox bluntly. "Our Führer believes in the power of will, but the enemy believes in the power of factories." The deeper tragedy was human. Within the very system designed to measure Germany's strength, the brightest minds were realizing their own insignificance. Their intelligence meant clarity, and clarity meant despair. Still, there were those who clung to pride. Some officers insisted that superior tactics, jet aircraft, and new weapons like the V-1 and V-2 could reverse the balance. But these innovations arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. The Allies were not only matching every new German weapon, they were building dozens of their own while feeding half the planet in the process. By autumn 1944, as Allied bombers darkened the skies above the Ruhr, the gap between faith and fact had become unbridgeable. The Reich's leaders still spoke of total victory, but their analysts spoke of total depletion. In the underground offices beneath Berlin, the final reports grew shorter. There was nothing new to add. The numbers said everything, and the numbers did not lie. By the summer of 1944, the illusion of balance was gone. Germany's analysts, now working in the shadowed basements of ministries and commandeered university buildings, prepared what would become their most consequential document, a comprehensive evaluation of Allied industrial power. It was known simply as Gesamtbericht zur Rüstungsproduktion der Feindmächte, Comprehensive Report on the Armament Production of the Enemy Powers. The report drew on captured intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and shipping data from neutral countries. It contained no rhetoric, no politics, only data, pages of graphs, ratios, and comparative tables. On one chart, the lines told the story plainly. American aircraft production in 1944, projected to exceed 96,000 units. British production, nearly 26,000. Combined Allied total, over 120,000 aircraft. More than 4 times the combined German and Axis output. Another table compared tank production. The United States and the Soviet Union together were producing 15,000 armored vehicles per month. Germany, even under total mobilization, could barely manage 1/800. The report's conclusion, written in restrained bureaucratic language, was devastating. The material superiority of the Allied powers has reached a level that precludes any long-term German military success. Even with the introduction of new weapons, the disparity in production and resources ensures eventual defeat. It was the first time such words appeared in an official Wehrmacht analysis. In August 1944, the report reached the desks of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the Reich Ministry for Armaments, and finally, Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler skimmed it in silence. His expression, witnesses recalled, did not change. Then, without comment, he pushed the file aside and ordered a discussion of new jet prototypes. To him, production numbers were abstractions. The war would be won by faith, not figures. But among those present, men like Jodl, Keitel, and Speer, the reaction was different. They understood the scale of what they had just read. For years, they had convinced themselves that German ingenuity could outpace Allied industry. Now the evidence was undeniable. Speer, recalling that meeting years later, wrote, "It was then that the last shadow of hope vanished. From that moment onward, our task was not to win, but to postpone the end." Outside the corridors of power, the numbers began to manifest in reality. Allied aircraft swarmed across Europe in such numbers that daylight now belonged entirely to the enemy. Bombers returned with photographs of factories, rail yards, and cities erased from maps. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was collapsing. Pilots fought outnumbered 5-1, sometimes 10. Replacement aircraft sat incomplete on factory floors, awaiting engines or fuel that would never arrive. For the analysts who had written the report, the irony was bitter. Their precision had exposed the truth, and the truth had changed nothing. The data had been gathered, the warning had been given, but no one at the top had the courage to act on it. And as Allied production continued to climb toward unimaginable heights, Germany's own factories were burning beneath the weight of their success. The numbers no longer needed analysis. They were now written in smoke across the skies of Europe. By September 1944, the mathematical nightmare the analysts had warned about came fully alive. The air above the Reich no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to the sky-darkening formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, guided by P-51 Mustangs that now had the range to escort them deep into Berlin itself. Every day, the results of America's industrial miracle unfolded in the German sky. What had once been theoretical, production numbers, tonnage charts, graphs of capacity, was now visible, roaring, and unstoppable. Entire industrial regions disappeared beneath waves of bombs. The synthetic fuel plants at Leuna, the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, and the aviation assembly lines of Regensburg, all were systematically targeted and reduced to rubble. The very infrastructure upon which the German war economy depended was being erased. For the analysts in Berlin, survival had become part of their routine. Reports arrived in fragments, half-burned documents, disrupted teletypes, broken communications. The Reich statistics were disintegrating along with its railways and power grids. In the underground offices of the Reich Ministry for Armaments, Albert Speer continued to fight a war of arithmetic. He shifted resources, rerouted supplies, and ordered workers to move production into tunnels, mines, and mountain caverns. But the effort was like trying to dam a flood with bare hands. Germany's economy had become a series of disconnected islands, pockets of industry operating in isolation, unable to communicate, unable to sustain the whole. Even the most determined engineers could not produce tanks without steel or aircraft without fuel. By October, the Luftwaffe was losing 200 aircraft per month, most destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. American losses in the same period were barely a tenth of that. When the analysts updated their final 1944 report, the tone had changed. Gone were the cautious words, the restrained phrasing. The conclusion was brutally simple. The enemy's material capacity has reached a point beyond our ability to resist. Each month of continued war increases our losses without altering the outcome. This time, even Speer did not contest it. On November 21, 1944, he met with Hitler in the Führerbunker and tried, for the last time, to make him understand. Speer presented the figures: steel shortages, fuel collapse, rail grid disintegration, and the devastating tempo of Allied bombing. He argued for a strategic withdrawal, a rational end to the war. Hitler's response was fury. He rejected the report, accusing his ministers of cowardice and defeatism. "Our enemies are strong because they have faith in numbers," he shouted. "We have faith in destiny." It was the end of reason. That winter, as Allied forces closed in from both east and west, the analytical departments quietly ceased their work. The men who had spent years measuring the pulse of a dying empire packed their files, burned classified reports, and waited for the inevitable. Outside, the war that had begun with the illusion of speed and superiority was now a slow, grinding collapse. The industrial empire of the United States, powered by assembly lines, fueled by oil, and directed by logistics, had become the ultimate weapon. It was not a bomb or a tank, but the relentless, mechanical certainty of production itself. And for the German analysts who had once believed numbers could serve victory, those same numbers had written the obituary of the Reich. Berlin, February 1945. The air itself seems thinner now, dry, metallic, and filled with ash. The once proud capital of the Reich has become a cratered wasteland of smoke and silence. Buildings stand like hollow shells. Streets are lined with wrecked trams and burned-out trucks. In the ruined corridors of the Reich Chancellery, the analysts who once charted the strength of the German war machine now sit idle. The numbers that once filled their charts, production, allocation, reserves, have vanished entirely. Germany, by every measurable standard, no longer possesses an economy capable of sustaining war. Fuel reserves, gone. Rail transport, fragmented. Aircraft output, below 10% of 1943 levels. Armored vehicle construction, halted in multiple factories due to lack of steel and power. Even the vaunted V-2 rocket program, once the symbol of German ingenuity, has been reduced to desperation, impressive in design, but strategically meaningless. Each missile that strikes London is another ton of steel and fuel that could have built a tank or trained a pilot. Across the Atlantic, the contrast could not be more staggering. By February 1945, the United States is operating over 70,000 aircraft, maintaining fleets across 2 oceans, and fielding armies on 3 continents. American factories now outproduce Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The Ford Willow Run plant alone builds a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit produces more armored vehicles in a single month than Germany can manage in half a year. The analysts in Berlin receive fragments of this data through intelligence intercepts, Allied propaganda leaflets, and foreign radio. Yet they no longer scoff at the claims. They have seen enough to know they are true. Even captured German officers, once defiant, now quietly ask their interrogators about American production. They are astonished by photographs of endless assembly lines, of women welding aircraft frames, of convoys stretching from New York to Liverpool. One captured Luftwaffe major reportedly stared at an aerial photo of the Douglas aircraft plant in California, covering 43 acres, and whispered, "That is what defeated us." In America, factories hum around the clock, powered by abundant electricity and secure supply chains. In Germany, factories burn or freeze in the dark. The Reich's rail system, once its industrial backbone, lies shattered under Allied bombs. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the War Production Board issues its final pre-invasion report. It lists over 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, and nearly 200 warships constructed since 1941. Every number is more than a statistic. It represents the triumph of organization, logistics, and willpower over ideology and ambition. For the German analysts who first sounded the alarm 2 years earlier, the grim satisfaction of accuracy offers no comfort. Their predictions have come true in full. The Reich's dream of domination has been buried under a mountain of American steel. And now, as the last fragments of their reports are burned to ash in the winter air, one truth stands clear. The outcome was not determined by generals or battlefields. It was decided by factories, by workers, by the invisible machinery of democracy at war. By April 1945, the evidence of total collapse could no longer be hidden, not even from those who had once refused to see it. The German Reich, once so proud of its mechanized precision and industrial might, now survived only on remnants. In Berlin, electricity flickered for minutes at a time. Food convoys rarely arrived. Even printing enough fuel ration cards had become an administrative challenge. Entire production chains had ceased to exist. Coal trains destroyed, power plants bombed, bridges gone. The analysts who had once measured production in thousands now counted what remained in tens. Their weekly reports had shrunk to single pages, handwritten, unverified, hopelessly incomplete. Each new Allied advance erased another column from their charts. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the sound of Allied bombers had become constant. The 8th Air Force now operated with near impunity, striking at what little remained of Germany's war industry. Entire train yards were vaporized in seconds. Inside what was left of the Reich Ministry for Armaments, Albert Speer continued to issue orders, but many were never carried out. Fuel shortages immobilized trucks. Workers deserted factories to find food. Even Hitler's elite divisions, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, fought with dwindling ammunition and without air cover. The contrast with the United States was now absolute. In March 1945, as American troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen, U.S. factories reached their peak wartime output. Liberty ships launched daily, long-range bombers filled European airfields, and new Sherman tanks rolled off production lines faster than they could be shipped overseas. America had achieved what no military power before it had accomplished: the full mobilization of a continent-sized industrial system for a single purpose. German officers captured at the front often expressed disbelief at the scale. Some refused to believe the numbers until they were shown photographs and factory blueprints. One Wehrmacht colonel, after examining post-capture data at a POW camp in France, reportedly remarked, "If I had seen these figures in 1942, I would have known the war was already lost." By May 1945, Germany was no longer a functioning state. Railways ceased, communications failed, and fuel ran out. The once feared Luftwaffe was effectively grounded. Even the most devoted Nazi officials knew the end had come. In the final days, remnants of the Analyst Corps gathered in a basement office beneath the ruins of the Chancellery. They salvaged what papers they could: fragments of production charts, memoranda from 1942, comparisons of American and German capacities. One officer, a mathematician by training, quietly murmured that the data should have been their guide, not their enemy. Outside, the guns of the Red Army echoed through the city. The war that had begun with dreams of domination ended in silence, smoke, and surrender. When Germany finally capitulated on May 8, 1945, the United States stood at the height of its industrial and military power. A nation transformed by war into the greatest production engine in human history. The Analysts' old conclusion, written 2 years earlier, now read like prophecy. Total victory against a nation that commands the full machinery of mass production is not possible. Their words were buried with the Reich they served, but their truth endured, written not in ideology, but in the cold arithmetic of steel, oil, and time. In the quiet that followed May 1945, the smoke cleared not only from battlefields, but from the very idea of what modern war meant. For the German officers who had once believed in speed, precision, and willpower as the tools of victory, the war had revealed a new and merciless truth. In the age of industry, power belonged not to the boldest army, but to the nation that could build the most, move the fastest, and replace what was lost. The United States had done what no empire of the past had achieved. It had turned its factories into an army, its engineers into soldiers, and its workers into the lifeblood of victory. Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle had become as decisive as Normandy or Midway. What Germany's analysts had seen in those captured reports was not just numbers. They had seen the future, a future in which wars would be determined long before the first shot was fired, by the capacity of machines, the rhythm of assembly lines, and the reach of logistics. For them, the realization came too late. But their moment of recognition, that long night in Berlin, under a single lamp and a stack of American production figures, marked a quiet turning point in history. They had peered into the industrial heart of their enemy and seen an unanswerable force, a democracy that could outbuild, outlast, and outthink its opponents. The war would end, the factories would fall silent, and the world would rebuild. But the lesson would endure that in the Second World War, victory belonged to those who mastered production, not destruction.